According to recent statistics, there has been an 18% rise in violent crime. In addition, we have just been informed about an ongoing police chase. The movie starts with news channels broadcasting distressing updates about escalating gang violence and widespread homicides in Columbus, Ohio, where over 300 shootings have taken place that year, resulting in nearly 50 gun-related deaths involving gang members. Crime rates in the city are high. Despite an overwhelming surge in criminal activity in the city, Governor John Messer has made a bold declaration of newfound peace, citing a remarkable 50% reduction in crime rates. However, during a press conference where he was met with protests about a proposed pipeline, Messer announced that his office has commissioned an environmental review to supplement the Environmental Protection Agency's audit. Abby Hill and her family were watching the press conference and were elated to hear the governor reference the work of Abby's mother, Vivian Hill, on the audit. After a few days, Vivian makes her way to the airport to welcome her husband, Stanley Hill, who has just returned from a job interview in California. Upon reaching the parking lot, the couple discovers that one of their car tires is flat. Stanley aids Vivian in changing the tire when suddenly a stranger approaches them and requests money. However, Stanley politely declines. Out of nowhere, a second person joins the first attacker and launches a surprise attack on Stanley from behind. In the midst of the brutal assault, one of the assailants, who has a fly tattoo on his face, stabs Vivian and steals her purse before fleeing the scene. Once the attackers have fled, Stanley, who is severely injured, gets up and runs to Vivian only to find her lifeless body, which leaves him in a state of heart-wrenching sorrow. Overwhelmed with grief, Stanley goes to the police station to file a report with Detectives Gibson and Walker. However, Detective Walker inexplicably asks Stanley if he and his wife were having any relationship issues, which frustrates Stanley. Later, for Vivian's final rites, Stanley visits her at the church but finds it too difficult to confront his sorrow and quickly departs before anyone else arrives. The news of Vivian's tragic passing spreads nationwide, prompting Governor Messer to extend his condolences to her family since Vivian was one of the auditors in his office. The governor pledges to assist in the pursuit of justice for the abhorrent crime. The following day, at the behest of the detectives, Stanley returns to the police station to identify the individuals responsible for the attack. He meticulously scrutinizes the lineup and successfully identifies the true perpetrator based on his descriptions. However, despite Stanley's positive identification, the detectives release the assailant when Stanley challenges their decision. Stanley confronts the detectives about their unprofessional conduct and demands an explanation. However, their inadequate response only adds to his despair. Disheartened by the outcome, he decides to leave since there seems to be nothing he can do. Stanley meets Abby to tell her about the corrupt police investigation, but his anger and frustration intensify when he spots Vivian's killer walking freely on the streets, causing him to boil over in rage. Filled with fury, Stanley rushes back to his home and destroys his wardrobe, uncovering a mysterious black envelope concealed behind the wall. The envelope contains numerous passports, foreign currencies, and lethal weapons, serving as a haunting reminder of Stanley's murky past before he married Vivian. Determined to find those responsible for Vivian's murder, Stanley contacts his former colleague and fellow tough guy, Dennis, and arranges to meet him at his barbershop. Dennis implores Stanley to reconsider his thirst for revenge, but Stanley remains resolute in his determination to avenge his wife's death. With the identities of the perpetrators in his possession, Dennis informs Stanley that the police have apprehended them 10 times each year. Despite the repeated arrests, Stanley notices that no further action is ever taken against the perpetrators. Determined to take matters into his own hands, he decides to go undercover and track them down himself. He begins his mission by posing as a gangster and keeping a low profile. One day, while at a nearby club, he spots one of the culprits, Nathan, handing over the stolen purse that belonged to Vivian to his girlfriend. As Stanley continues to monitor Nathan's activities, Nathan becomes increasingly uncomfortable with his presence. After recognizing Stanley's true identity, Nathan smashes his whiskey glass and makes a run for it. A frantic chase ensues with Stanley hot on his heels until they come face to face behind the bar. Stanley confronts Nathan and manages to subdue him, standing over the fallen man with the intention of delivering a final blow. The man suggests that Vivian's murder was not just a random robbery. As tensions rise, Dennis appears on the scene. They dispose of Nathan's body by burning it in a trash can. Unbeknownst to them, a member of Nathan's gang captures the gruesome act on camera. Without hesitation, Charlie agrees to the order and begins to track down Stanley and Dennis. Meanwhile, Stanley receives an anonymous call informing him that someone has been hired to kill him and Dennis. In response, Stanley prepares for the inevitable showdown by gathering weapons and devising a plan. As Charlie and his gang close in, Stanley and Dennis engage in a fierce battle, resulting in several casualties on both sides. Meanwhile, Lemmy K contacts detectives Gibson and Walker, urging them to find those responsible for the disappearance of his men. As the investigation progresses, a shocking revelation is uncovered. The detectives are colluding with Lemmy K to protect his men from imprisonment, in exchange for his silence on Governor Messer's son's damning video. In the footage, the governor's son is shown brutally murdering his girlfriend after giving her crystal drugs. Following his lead on the number found on Nathan's phone, Stanley heads to Zombie Tattoo with the intention of confronting Lars. However, when he arrives, he discovers that Lars is not present, and instead encounters another worker at the shop. Meanwhile, Detective Gibson meets with Governor Messer and reveals the connection between Lemmy K's men and the corrupt detectives. The governor urges Gibson to identify the culprits to prevent his son's damning video from being leaked. Dennis hurries to his shop, alerted by the alarm, and confronts Charlie and his gang, who are attempting to extract Stanley's name from Dennis using force. However, Dennis proves to be a more formidable opponent than Charlie anticipated, with his expert fighting skills. As Stanley gets the Wrath tattoo on his back, Lars becomes increasingly suspicious of him when he repeatedly brings up Charlie's name. In a fit of rage, Lars demands that Stanley reveals his identity. But instead of complying, Stanley attacks him, pressing a cutter against Lars's neck to force him to reveal Charlie's location. Stanley is consumed by guilt over his past life as a gangster and the loss of his beloved Vivian. He steals Lars' drug shipment and joins Dennis to dispose of the bodies, all while haunted by the weight of his actions. He seeks solace at a church, where he confides in a priest, confessing his sins and pleading for forgiveness. Despite this attempt at redemption, Stanley is still driven by his desire for vengeance. As Abby arrives at Stanley's home to collect Vivian's belongings, she discovers guns and gangster portfolios scattered around. However, before she and her husband can leave, they are ambushed by Charlie and his men, who fire rounds at their car, injuring Abby's husband. Fortunately, Stanley arrives in time to stop the attack. Moving to the governor's mansion, Messerv is informed about more deaths of Lemmy K's crew. Frustrated, he declares that he's done with the amateurs and demands professionals to hunt down the perpetrators. On the other hand, Lemmy K becomes enraged upon discovering that his drug shipment has been stolen and warns Charlie. Meanwhile, Stanley hides in the basement of his barbershop and gets hold of Charlie's number by stealing Lars' phone, promising to return the missing goods. Stanley and Dennis set up a trap for Charlie, luring him to a Korean club under the pretense of returning his stolen drug shipment. However, once inside the VIP room, Charlie becomes paranoid and accuses an innocent stranger of stealing from him. The tension escalates as the stranger and his bodyguard draw their weapons, and Stanley barges into the room without permission, causing chaos. In the midst of the commotion, Stanley confronts Charlie and forces him to reveal that Lemmy K was behind Vivian's murder. With time running out, Stanley takes matters into his own hands and shoots Charlie dead. As gunmen close in on them, Stanley and Dennis work together to fight them off and make a harrowing escape. They narrowly avoid the police and manage to flee the scene. After returning to the basement with Dennis and learning the dangerous truth about gangster Lemmy K, Stanley decides to prioritize his family's safety and orders them to pack up and move to a hotel. When Stanley returns to his house, he stumbles upon a shocking report revealing that Vivian, who worked for the governor, was forced to compromise public water safety for profits in the pipeline project. As Stanley delves deeper into Vivian's investigation, he listens to her voicemail and learns that Governor Messer coerced her into hiding the hazards of the pipeline project. Suspecting that Vivian's death was a cover-up to conceal the truth about the contaminated water, Stanley becomes determined to bring justice to her name. Meanwhile, as Abby and her family prepare to flee for their safety, they are unexpectedly attacked by Lemmy K and his gang. Under the pressure of Lemmy K, Abby is forced to call her father. The situation quickly escalates, and in a daring move, Abby tries to defend herself and her family by attacking one of Lemmy K's henchmen with a knife. But Lemmy K retaliates by shooting down Abby's daughter, leaving the fate of her family hanging in the balance. Abby, under pressure from Lemmy K, sends a text message to Stanley, but in a clever move, she calls her son Joey instead of Jimmy to warn him about the danger. Stanley receives Abby's warning message and quickly contacts Dennis for help. They rush to the scene and Stanley sneaks in through the back door, taking down one of Lemmy K's men. However, their victory is short-lived as Lemmy K captures Abby and forces Stanley to surrender his weapon. With the situation dire, Dennis arrives just in time and takes a shot at Lemmy K with his sniper rifle, saving Abby. As Stanley interrogates Lemmy K, he learns that Messer ordered the hit on Vivian to cover up the pipeline project's dangers. Stanley then decides to expose Messer's corruption to the public, and with Dennis' help, he gathers evidence to support his claims. Meanwhile, Abby and her family are taken to safety, and Dennis is rushed to the hospital to receive medical attention. With justice served, Stanley and his family can finally live without fear of retribution. As Lemmy K is about to reveal the truth, he is brutally killed by the corrupt detective Gibson. Gibson attempts to coerce Stanley into taking a bribe, but Stanley stands firm in his principles. This leads to a showdown with Gibson's accomplice, Detective Walker, who is swiftly defeated by Dennis as he tries to surprise them from behind. Gibson tries to reason with Stanley once more, but Stanley is resolute and arrests Gibson, handcuffing him to the steering wheel of his car, while Walker is locked in the trunk. As they make their way to Messier's mansion, Gibson drops a bombshell on Stanley, revealing the truth about the governor and why Lemmy K and his men are untouchable. However, Stanley remains determined to uncover the truth behind Vivian's murder and refuses to release Gibson from his cuffs. Upon arriving at the mansion, Gibson pleads with Stanley to let him talk to the governor, but Stanley insists on accompanying him. After rendering Gibson unconscious with a blow to the head, Stanley proceeds to take down the outside guards of the governor's mansion. He then sets a bomb in the car with Gibson still handcuffed inside, and Walker barely manages to escape the trunk before it explodes. Stanley takes out the remaining security guards and charges into the mansion, determined to uncover the truth about Vivian's murder. In a final showdown, Stanley confronts Governor Meserve, who quickly shoots him with a shotgun. However, Stanley manages to get back on his feet and disarm Meserve. Holding the shotgun to Meserve's head, Stanley demands answers about Vivian's murder. Meserve breaks down and admits to killing Vivian because she refused to cooperate with his corrupt practices. In a moment of fury, Stanley stabs Meserve with a nearby object, causing him to fall to the ground and die. News of the intrusion at the governor's mansion quickly spreads, prompting a large police response to surround the building. Stanley emerges from the mansion, holding Messer's shotgun, and when the police order him to drop the weapon, he instead aims it at them, prompting them to open fire. Despite being hit, Stanley manages to stay alive thanks to the bulletproof vest provided by Dennis. After being taken into police custody, Stanley's daughter Abby is denied access to visit him in the hospital. Fearful that her father will be sent to a remote location and never seen again, Abby impulsively enters his hospital room to bid him a farewell hug. However, that night, 2 police officers are stationed outside Stanley's hospital room, including Walker, who has joined their ranks. Following his demotion to patrol police, Walker covertly enters Stanley's hospital room with the intention of framing Stanley for an attempted escape and subsequently killing him. However, his plan is thwarted when Abby's farewell hug to her father intentionally leaves a hidden gun within Stanley's reach. Stanley retaliates and fatally shoots Walker. At the same time, Dennis, disguised as a doctor, reveals himself and assists Stanley in escaping police custody. Dennis and Stanley manage to evade the police and escape to São Paulo, Brazil, sometime later. Abby receives a postcard from her father, expressing his gratitude for her help and reassuring her of his safety. With his quest for revenge against the governor for his wife's death complete, Stanley finally finds the peace and justice he has been seeking.